I worked as a custodian at a middle school for almost 5 years, usually on the overnight shift. I would clock in around 10 at night and stay until just before the sun came up, when the buses began pulling in. At first, I genuinely liked the job. I did not have to deal with kids running down the hallways, teachers complaining about stuff, or anyone else for that matter. The quiet did not bother me, and I appreciated being left alone to do my work. As time passed, however, I began to notice how different the school felt at night compared to during the day. It was not just quiet, it felt dead. The building creaked and groaned as if it were breathing. When you are the only person inside, even the smallest sound will set you on edge. You would hear a locker pop open by itself or the pipes knocking in the walls, and your brain would insist those were footsteps. I learned to ignore much of that, but there was one part of the school I never got used to: the basement. The school was old, built in the 1950s, and the basement ran beneath half of the building. It was not finished nicely like the classrooms. Instead, it was a concrete maze of storage rooms and long, narrow halls with pipes and wires hanging overhead. Some rooms were full of old desks. Some contained boxes of outdated textbooks. Others held broken furniture stacked in unstable piles. It always smelled damp and musty down there. The fluorescent lights buzzed and flickered when they worked at all. A lot of the time, I had to bring a flashlight just to see where I was going. When I first started, one of the older custodians advised me to avoid the basement unless I absolutely had to go down there. He said it was not worth the trouble and joked that it was haunted. I laughed along, but even during that first week I felt uneasy in that section of the building. It was like stepping into a different world compared to the bright hallways upstairs. There were nights when I would pass the basement door and feel a chill just from looking at it, but usually I did not have to go down there, so I avoided it whenever possible. About 2 years into the job, though, I had a list of tasks taped to my cart, and one of them required me to bring up a set of folding chairs for an event. I groaned when I saw it because the only place those chairs were stored was the basement. I remember standing at the top of the stairwell door for a full minute debating whether I could ask my supervisor to postpone the task until morning, but I did not want to seem lazy. So I grabbed my flashlight and opened the heavy door. The stairwell echoed with every step I took. My boots sounded far too loud in that space. I reached the bottom and flipped the switch, but only a couple of the overhead lights came on, leaving most of the hallway in darkness. It smelled like wet cement down there. I turned on my flashlight and began to walk. The chairs were supposed to be in the second storage room on the left. The first room I passed was filled with desks piled to the ceiling. The second door was half rusted and screeched like nails on a chalkboard when I pulled it open. Inside, the room smelled of dust and old wood polish. The folding chairs were stacked against the wall in uneven piles. I bent down and began pulling them out, trying to carry as many as I could at once so I would not have to make so many trips. I had just lifted 4 when I froze. From somewhere out in the hallway I heard a soft dragging sound, as if someone were slowly sliding their shoe across the floor. I held my breath, still bent over with the chairs in my arms, listening as hard as I could. The sound stopped. I straightened and peeked into the hallway, shining the flashlight both ways. The beam cut through the dark, but there was nothing there. My heart thumped in my ears. I stood there for what felt like forever before telling myself it was probably just the pipes, or that I had shifted a chair without noticing. I carried the first load out into the hallway and toward the stairs. As I walked, a sudden cold draft brushed my face and I stopped mid-step. The basement was always warm and stale. No windows, no moving air, but this felt like standing next to an open freezer. I scanned up and down the corridor with my light, but nothing looked different. I shook it off, set the chairs at the bottom of the stairs and went back for more. When I returned to the storage room, something felt off. The stack of chairs looked different somehow, as if they had shifted while I was gone. I frowned, trying to recall exactly how they had been leaning. I told myself I was being paranoid and picked up another load. This time, as I turned to leave, I heard it again. A thump followed by a scraping sound coming from farther down the basement hallway. My flashlight beam shook in my hand as I aimed it that way. About 20 feet down, one of the overhead lights that had been out flickered to life, then went dark again, plunging a section of the corridor into deeper shadow. The scraping noise stopped. For a moment there was nothing but the hum of the fluorescent lights and the distant drip of water. I felt my palms grow slick on the metal frames of the chairs. I kept my back to the room and started walking to the stairs as quickly as I dared. Each step seemed louder than the last. The cold draft returned and moved along the corridor as if something had passed by. At the doorway to the stairwell, I hesitated, looking back toward the darkened corridor. The beam of my flashlight found nothing but empty halls and stacked boxes. Still, I felt watched. I took the stairs 2 at a time and pushed the heavy door closed behind me. When I reached the main floor, the familiar hum of the heating system and the warm, dry air felt like safety. I set the chairs where they needed to go and told myself that basements were simply strange places and that my imagination had taken over after too many hours alone. But even after that night, when I walked past the basement door, I no longer felt only a casual unease. There was a weight to it now, a memory that settled in my chest and made me avoid that part of the building whenever I could. One of the classroom doors that should have been closed tight was cracked open. My stomach dropped. I knew I had not touched that door. The school was locked every night and no one else was supposed to be there except me. I stood frozen in the doorway of the storage room, staring at that cracked door. Every part of me screamed to drop the chairs and run upstairs, but I simply stood there. I told myself, perhaps the door had come loose, or when I opened another door the air pressure shifted. I clung to those excuses like a lifeline. I carried the chairs quickly to the stairwell, then returned with my flashlight in one hand and my other hand empty. The cracked door remained open, only wide enough for someone to peek out. My throat went dry. I crept toward it slowly, each step echoing off the concrete. When I was near, I called, "Hello, anyone down here?" My voice cracked and sounded small in the huge, empty basement. There was no answer. I swallowed and pushed the door open fast with my free hand, sweeping the flashlight inside. The room was empty, dusty shelves of science equipment, boxes stacked high, cobwebs in the corners. I stepped in for a second, heart racing, listening for any sound. That was when I heard it again, a dragging shuffle. This time it was behind me in the hallway. I spun around and sent the beam of my flashlight down the corridor. There was nothing, only shadows and concrete. Still, I felt it, that heavy pressure that comes when you know you are being watched. My skin prickled all over. I no longer cared about the chairs. I backed up slowly, keeping the flashlight trained on the hallway, and made my way to the stairwell. At the stairs, I grabbed the chairs I had left and carried them up 2 steps at a time. I did not stop until I was back in the main hallway upstairs, gasping for breath. I leaned against the wall, sweating although the school was cold. I told myself I was imagining things. Maybe it had been rats or the pipes, but the cracked door made no sense. I locked the stairwell door behind me even though I was not supposed to, and I did not go back down for the rest of the night. A week later, while mopping the hallway right above the basement stairs, I heard it again. 3 loud bangs, evenly spaced, like someone hitting the wall with their fist. The mop slipped from my hand and water sloshed onto the tiles. I froze and listened. Then I heard the basement door rattle as if someone had shoved it from the other side. My blood ran cold. I did not open it. I stood there gripping the mop handle until the sound stopped. After that night, I refused to go into the basement alone. If anything needed to be brought up, I waited until another custodian was available. I never told my coworkers what I had heard because I knew they would either laugh or chalk it up to the so-called ghost. But I remember the slow, dragging footsteps behind me, and thinking of them makes me feel sick to this day. I worked as a custodian at a high school for 3 years. I was the newest member of the team, so most of the overnight shifts fell to me. The building was enormous, 4 floors and 2 gyms, and at night when it was empty, it felt like a giant maze. The rule was to cover the building floor by floor, room by room, turn off lights, empty trash, and lock doors. It typically took the entire night to complete, and if a person rushed, something would inevitably be missed. One Friday night I was working alone because one of the other custodians had called out sick. Normally we worked in pairs, so I was not used to handling the building by myself. At first the shift was ordinary. I began on the first floor, emptying trash cans, wiping down surfaces, and mopping hallways. The lights in some of the older corridors flickered, which made the shadows jump, but I told myself it was simply the building settling. Around midnight I made my way to the 3rd floor. That level always gave me a bad feeling because it was quieter than the rest. It housed many older classrooms that were no longer in regular use. Some were permanently locked. Others served as storage rooms filled with dusty books, broken furniture, and old lab equipment. As I walked down the hallway I passed the lockers. The metallic click of their doors and the echo of my boots on tile made me jump several times. I kept telling myself it was normal. I was halfway through mopping one of the main hallways when I noticed a door about 20 feet away was open. That struck me immediately because I had already checked every room earlier that evening, and I was certain I had locked them all. My first instinct was to hurry past it and ignore the anomaly. Yet something made me stop. I set my mop down and took a few cautious steps toward the open door. The hallway felt colder. My breath came a little faster. I peered into the room and saw only the familiar. Old posters peeling at the corners, students' desks in neat rows, a chalkboard with faded scribbles. Nothing seemed out of place, but the fact that the door was ajar troubled me. I closed it and locked it, then double-checked the lock to be certain. Still, unease lingered like a bad smell. I continued my rounds, but I could not shake the feeling that someone else was somewhere in the building. Every distant noise, the hum of the HVAC, the drip of a faucet, the clatter of a loose vent, felt amplified as though the whole school had become a collection of tiny alarms. I kept looking over my shoulder, and every time I passed a doorway, I slowed down to make sure it was firmly shut. By the end of the shift I had finished my tasks, but the memory of that open door stayed with me. I told myself I had simply been tired, that I must have missed it when I did my first check. Even so, as I left the building that morning with the sunrise at the horizon, I felt a lingering tension, the same one that follows when a place refuses to be entirely explained. I set the mop against the wall and walked toward the open classroom slowly, trying to make as little noise as possible. The door was one of those old wooden classroom doors with a square glass window at eye level. I pushed it open cautiously, the hinges groaning faintly, and shined my flashlight inside. The room appeared empty at first glance. The desks were stacked neatly along the walls and boxes were piled in the corners. Nothing seemed out of place, until my eyes landed on a single box near the back wall. Unlike the others, it was tilted, not aligned with the rest, and scuff marks on the tiles showed where it had been dragged across the floor. My stomach dropped. I knew I had closed this door earlier, and I knew I had not moved that box. I tried to reason with myself, convincing my nerves that I was tired, that my imagination was running wild after hours of cleaning. I pulled the door shut again and went back to mopping, but my mind would not leave that room. Over and over, I thought about the box, about the fact that it had been moved. I wondered if maybe a student had somehow slipped inside, hiding for some reason. I considered checking the windows, but I knew they were all locked from the inside and the hallway doors were locked too. The thought left me unsettled. I forced myself to focus on my work, trying to drown out the crawling sense of being watched. When I finished that hallway and headed toward the stairwell to move down to the second floor, I passed by that classroom again, and my heart nearly stopped. The door was wide open. My breath caught in my throat. I knew for certain that I had shut it tight before. My steps faltered as I approached slowly, shining the flashlight inside. The room looked the same, except now the box had been moved again. It sat directly in the center of the classroom like someone wanted it to be noticed. My pulse raced in my ears. I whispered, "Hello, who's in here?" My voice sounded so small against the silence of the building. No answer. Then from the far end of the classroom I heard it, slow, deep breathing. Not the sound of pipes or a draft. It was deliberate. A person's breath. Heavy. Trying to be quiet, but not quiet enough. I froze, my heart pounding, every muscle in my body tense. I tried to convince myself it had to be a student playing a prank. But how could that be? All the doors were locked. I was the only one in the building. My courage snapped. I slammed the door shut and sprinted down the hallway toward the stairwell. My chest burned as I pressed my back against the cold stairwell door, sweat soaking my shirt despite the chill. I debated calling my supervisor. I hated disturbing him in the middle of the night, but I could not handle this alone. Finally, with trembling hands, I dialed his number. When he answered, I told him everything as calmly as I could manage, though my voice shook. He said he would come, but it would take him about 20 minutes. Those 20 minutes felt like hours. I stayed far away from that hallway, glancing over my shoulder every few seconds, expecting to see something, or someone, coming toward me. When he finally arrived, the sight of him carrying a large flashlight was the biggest relief I had ever felt. Together we walked back to the classroom. The box was still sitting in the middle of the floor, exactly as I had last seen it. My supervisor strode inside without hesitation, checking behind desks, under tables, inside closets, anywhere someone could hide. There was nothing. No student. No intruder. He brushed it off, telling me I was just tired and imagining things. I did not argue, but I knew better. I had heard that breathing. That slow, heavy breathing that filled the room when no one was supposed to be there. I tried to finish the rest of the shift with him around, but I could not shake the dread. Every time we walked past that classroom, I felt a weight in the air, like the hallway itself pressed down on me. Sweeping, mopping, none of it distracted me. Each shadow stretched too long, every locker seemed ready to burst open, and I caught myself flinching at the smallest noise. Weeks later, while working with another custodian, I mentioned the classroom in passing. He told me a story. Years ago, a student had been caught hiding there overnight trying to pull a prank. The incident had unsettled staff so much that the classroom was rarely used again. The explanation fit, but it still did not account for the breathing I had heard that night. I finished the shift, but the memory clung to me. I began taking extra precautions, double-checking locks, shining my flashlight at every angle, staying close to stairwells when I had to pass that hallway. Months later, another overnight shift landed on me. Alone again. I put off the third floor as long as I could, dreading it. When I finally had no choice but to go up, I moved as quickly as possible, my heart thudding with every step. The sense of being watched clung to me. Even in rooms far from that hallway, I felt eyes on me. Every creak of the floor, every shift of air made me jump. I finished the shift and left without daring to look back. After that, I refused to work that floor by myself ever again. Even years later, whenever I had to pass through, I hurried. I never found out if it had truly been a student or something else altogether. But the memory never left me, the sound of that heavy breathing in a classroom that should have been empty. Sometimes, even now, I can still hear it in my head. During the day, the auditorium looked completely normal. But at night, when the building was empty, it felt like stepping into an entirely different place. Even with all of the lights on, there were shadows in every corner, shadows that always seemed darker and heavier than they should have been. Sound carried strangely in that space. If you dropped something as simple as a broom, the echo would stretch on, bouncing around the walls and ceiling, making it almost impossible to tell exactly where the sound had originally come from. Most nights, I deliberately saved the auditorium for last because I absolutely hated going in there. There was just something about it that always made my skin crawl. Near the end of winter one year, however, I did not have the luxury of saving it for last. There was going to be a school play the following morning, and I had to get it cleaned earlier than usual. It was around midnight when I dragged my cart to the side door. The heavy door creaked loudly as I pulled it open, and when it slammed shut behind me, the echo rolled across the empty space like thunder. I began by sweeping the aisles between the seats. The chairs were old, some rows having metal folding seats bolted firmly into the floor, while other rows contained seats that were loose and rattled if you brushed against them. As I pushed the broom, I could hear the scraping sound bouncing back at me, stretching unnaturally long in the silence. After a few minutes of sweeping, I thought I heard something else. At first it was faint, almost like a soft rustling from the stage. I froze, staring in that direction, thinking maybe a piece of scenery or a prop had fallen over. But when I looked carefully, the stage was completely empty. I shook my head, convincing myself it was nothing, and went back to sweeping. But then it happened again. This time it was clearer, sharper. It was the sound of slow, deliberate footsteps moving across the stage. I stopped, my broom hanging in midair, and stared at the stage. I could see the stacked props sitting in the corners where they always were, untouched. Nothing moved. Yet the sound was unmistakable. My breathing became shallow as I slowly climbed the steps up to the stage, flashlight in hand. I aimed the beam behind the curtains and into the wings. There were ropes, pulleys, forgotten chairs, and painted scenery leaning against the walls. Everything was covered in dust, and as my flashlight cut across it, the particles danced and swirled, almost as if the dust itself were alive. The sensation that someone, or something, was near me would not go away. I backed slowly off the stage, forcing myself to think rationally. Maybe the building was settling. Maybe there were mice or birds up in the rafters. But deep down, I did not believe those excuses. I returned to the aisles and swept quickly, wanting nothing more than to finish and get out. My mind replayed the sound of those footsteps over and over, even though they were no longer there. When I finished sweeping the lower level, I started mopping. That was when I thought I saw a shadow flicker across the second tier of seats. I swung my flashlight up toward the balcony, but there was nothing there. I muttered to myself that it was just a trick of the light, but I could not shake the feeling that someone was watching me. I kept my back close to the wall as I worked, moving faster than usual. I was nearly finished with the main floor when I heard it again. A whisper. It was faint, almost impossible to make out, but it was definitely a whisper, and it came from the balcony above me. My heart began hammering so hard I could hear it in my ears. My flashlight shook in my hands as I pointed it upward. I wanted to run, but I forced myself to stay. I still had work to finish. I tried to convince myself it was a noise from outside, or maybe another custodian who had forgotten something. But in my gut, I knew that I was completely alone. The whispering continued, drifting across the upper seats, almost like it was moving closer to me. I tried calling out, but my voice came out weak and shaky, echoing back at me in a pathetic way. No one answered. Only the echo came back. I finished mopping the floor as quickly as I could and then made myself go back to the stage. The steps felt endless. Every time I moved my flashlight, I caught the sense of something moving just out of reach of the beam. Sometimes it was only a flicker, sometimes nothing at all, but the feeling gnawed at me. When I reached the stage, I looked down at the main floor. The seats stretched into the darkness. I shined the flashlight up at the balcony again. For a moment, I could have sworn I saw a figure sitting in the seats, just a dark silhouette against the dim light. My breath caught. I blinked and it was gone. Maybe it had been nothing more than a coat draped over a chair, but my nerves were shredded. I tried to focus on something physical, dusting, moving props, tidying up. But then it came again. The whispering. This time it was so much clearer, so close, and it sounded like it was speaking my name. I spun around so fast that the flashlight nearly flew out of my grip. The stage was empty. The props were still in their places, the curtains heavy and still, but the voice had been real. I knew it. I backed toward the side door, trying to keep my breathing under control. Just as I reached the edge of the stage, I stopped to listen one last time. That was when I heard the footsteps again, slow and deliberate, pacing across the balcony above. I told myself it was impossible. The doors had been locked. Nobody else was in the building. But the footsteps continued, stopping, starting, pacing, like someone was circling and watching me. That was it. I broke. I sprinted for the door, yanked it open, and felt the cold night air slam into me. Relief hit me in a wave, but even outside, I could still hear faint echoes of the footsteps from inside, fading slowly away. My hands shook so violently I nearly dropped the keys as I locked the door. I leaned against it, gasping for air, sweat dripping down my face. I refused to go back in. The next morning, I told another custodian what had happened. He laughed it off, telling me it was an old building that creaked and settled at night. Maybe he was right. But I could not forget that whisper, the way my name had been spoken, or the footsteps that seemed to follow me. Weeks later, I learned that years ago, a drama teacher had collapsed and died of a heart attack during a rehearsal on that very stage, right in front of his students. People said that sometimes you could still hear him walking the stage late at night, or hear voices whispering from the seats. I tried to dismiss it as nothing more than a story, but deep down, I knew better. I will never forget how that voice whispered my name, or how the footsteps echoed above me. Maybe I was losing my mind. Maybe I was not. But what I experienced was real to me. I quit that job not long after. Even before then, I refused to clean the auditorium ever again. And yet, sometimes, even when the building was full of people, I would still feel that same cold pressure in the air, that same suffocating sense of being watched. To this day, the memory baffles me. But I know one thing for certain. What I experienced in that auditorium was no trick of the imagination. It was real.